and he joins us now on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Max, thanks for coming back on board so soon after we spoke with you last. I wanted to talk to you about the fast developing political situation in the United States, where Nikki Haley has finally withdrawn, and Donald Trump is the heir presumptive of the Republican nomination, just at the time when Joe Biden's senility and dramatic decline in intellectual cognition has become ever more obvious to everyone. It's Donald Trump for president in November, isn't it?
Well, first of all, George, congratulations on such a huge victory. As I said on Twitter, it's a rare glint of hope in the midst of Gaza's dark night. And maybe I'll be joining you there at some point to talk more about what we're going to talk about now in front of an audience in London, if I'm allowed in.
Yes, you will be.
Inshallah. And what we're experiencing here in the United States is a moment of extreme political uncertainty. No one knows who will be the nominee for the Democratic Party, given that most voters, Democratic voters who voted for Biden in 2020, consider his age to be a serious issue, which may even be disqualifying. But they're just storming him through all of these primaries, hoping that he can pass through without any opposition. And he will face, likely, Donald Trump, who's facing all sorts of indictments amid a campaign of obvious lawfare in which the Democratic party elite is freaking out because the Supreme Court is refusing to disqualify Donald Trump from certain ballots. And so it looks like he will stand for election. And then you have an electorate that is less enthusiastic about either candidate than even among Trump's own base than we've seen in the past. And you're witnessing this dramatic protest vote against Joe Biden, particularly in areas where there are more highly educated young people who tune into alternative media, like the kind that we produce, in protest of his sponsorship of the genocide in Gaza. 20% of all voters in Minnesota, close to 20%, voted uncommitted in protest of the genocide, over 100,000 in Michigan. So that's going to go all the way to the convention in Chicago. In 1968, where Richard Daley's police staged a riot against anti-war protesters outside the convention and shut them down inside the convention. We're going to witness a similar protest. And if the genocide continues into the summer, it's going to make what happened in 1968 look like a gentle coffee klatch.
I think all of that is exactly as I was reading it, but I needed more clarification from you on the Supreme Court decision. It was unanimous, unexpectedly, but it has restored Trump to the ballot in Colorado. Is that a harbinger? Is that a harbinger of an absolute restoration across the rest of the country, or might there still be hiccups for Trump?
I mean, I think what we saw in Colorado was an aberration, because there you had a Secretary of State who was looking for political prominence among the anti-Trump fanatics. She didn't have any constitutional authority to suspend him from the ballot, or he didn't have any constitutional authority to suspend him from the ballot. I'm sorry. The Colorado court made a very arbitrary ruling in Colorado. I'm getting it confused with Maine. And it was always going to be appealed at the Supreme Court. The judges who voted to suspend Trump did so on very weak grounds. And so I'm not surprised that this happened. And I think the freakout we're seeing by the Democrats, by the kind of party establishment, is relating to the fact that it's going to be very difficult to disqualify him from other ballots. But I think, for those who are true Democrats, small d Democrats, We need to understand the danger of a highly politicized campaign to strip someone from their ability to run for office, an incumbent president, solely on the basis of the fact that they're seen as a rogue figure by the opposition. It's the kind of politics that takes place in countries where the U.S. imposes sanctions and alleges that elections were stolen or rigged, where the U.S. is what the U.S. is currently doing to Venezuela, which has suspended a putschist, insurrectionist candidate funded by the United States and trained by the United States, Maria Corina Machado, from standing against incumbent President Nicolas Maduro in the upcoming elections. The U.S. is doing the same thing within its own borders.
Yes. Now, of course, they're running out of time for the lawfare, aren't they? I mean, it's already March. The election is in November. Given the snail's pace at which U.S. justice or injustice travels, it's overwhelmingly likely that it will be Trump versus Biden.
Yeah, can you imagine the debates? I mean, Trump has had his own problems with slurring, but I mean, Joe Biden drifts off after about a minute or two. He was actually on a late night talk show in the U.S. and was mocking Donald Trump's age and trailed off himself and said, well, never mind. So the debates are going to be incredibly interesting. It's going to be a sad commentary on the state of the American political system and on the party establishment in both parties, but especially within the Democratic Party, where an increasingly, I would say a plurality of Democrats want to replace Biden, feel like their intelligence is being insulted by having such an uncharismatic figure who's not even present, who was determined by a Justice Department Solicitor General to not be mentally competent enough to be fully aware of his own son's corruption in the Burisma case. I think there's a lot of discontentment aside from the Gaza issue. And then we haven't even talked about the economy, which I assume you're experiencing the same thing across the puddle there, where average people just can't afford groceries anymore.
Quite. Now, we've not talked about laughing gas Kamala. Is there a possibility, even at this late hour, that she might actually be shoehorned in instead of Joe? Maybe his bath chair slips or some other mishap, and that they put her in? Is that even still possible at this stage?
I mean, the Democrats would have to be incredibly Machiavellian to do something like that. They would decide to lose the general election to Donald Trump and decide that it's easier for them to be throwing rocks on the outside of the White House. They always raise a ton of money when Donald Trump is president. The media elite love Donald Trump in office. People actually watch their conspiracy programs like Rachel Maddow's, which spent 4 years convincing her audience that Donald Trump would eventually be removed from office, arrested and jailed for his secret ties to Vladimir Putin and his collusion with Russia. None of this turned out to be true, but Rachel Maddow made herself into a major celebrity, made millions of dollars, is now on the lecture circuit, earning tons of money. So they may actually want Donald Trump to win. There's no way they're going to win with Kamala Harris, who has never won a delegate in any presidential election in her life. An unknown character actually beat Joe Biden in American Samoa last night, who had never campaigned there. He won 3 delegates. That's more than Kamala Harris has ever won. Kamala Harris's popularity for a black vice president, for the first black vice president, is low among black voters compared to other black public figures who have stood for the presidency, like, for example, Jesse Jackson. She's essentially someone who's been placed there by Obama from behind the curtain, just as Joe Biden was. And if you look at her numbers among the general electorate, she's less popular than Joe Biden. The Biden administration, their public relations team, has sought to hide her from view, and they're allowing her to surface for two reasons. One, Biden is unable to handle the rigors of the presidential stump or the campaign. And number two, the unpopularity of Biden among minority and young voters, specifically related to the issue of Gaza, which is why Kamala Harris was trotted out to Selma, Alabama, this historically significant civil rights site, to call for a phony ceasefire. And after she waited for the applause line, then she said, for 6 weeks, meaning Israel gets a genocidal vacation.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Does that seem to mean that there will be a 6-week ceasefire? Can we infer that the U.S. still has enough control over its own attack dog, Netanyahu, to be able to pull that off?
What I think the U.S. has been doing, whether it's in Doha or elsewhere, is trying to get the Israelis on the same page for a 6-week genocide vacation. And once they got the Israelis to agree to that, they started to point the finger at Hamas, to blame Hamas for the starvation of people in Gaza, to blame Hamas for the aid not getting in, and declare that until Hamas accepts this 6-week quote unquote humanitarian pause, the aid couldn't go in. And now everything is on Hamas's shoulders, which means that Israel and the U.S. are working hand in glove to twist Hamas's arm on the issue of prisoners, because Israel doesn't want any of the major security prisoners, which it holds in prisons in Israel and the West Bank, like Marwan Barghouti, to come out. The thing that Israel fears most is a national unity government, a Palestinian national unity government that features Hamas without Hamas taking the lead and a popular figure like Barghouti at its head. So all of these negotiations, to me, feel like the U.S. acting in its historic role as Israel's lawyer.
Yeah, let's switch theaters for a moment. Today in Kiev, Mayor Klitschko signed an edict abolishing Tchaikovsky Street and renaming it Victoria Nuland Street. You can see why Tchaikovsky, Victoria Nuland. I mean, in historical terms, cultural terms, you can see the reasons why. Tell us what you think. I think it was Talleyrand said on the death of a political opponent. What did he mean by that? What does Victoria Nuland's resignation or retirement mean? What does she mean by that?
Did that actually happen? They changed the name of the street?
Yes, this day.
I mean, it just shows you how debased and cartoonish the post-Maidan regime installed by Victoria Nuland in Kiev has become. They would replace a street named for a famous Russian composer with a scarcely known neoconservative U.S. operative who served in Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, honestly, don't know precisely why Victoria Nuland resigned. There may have been some major disagreement about the plan for Ukraine. She was openly pushing for a major U.S. delivery of aid and weapons to persecute the war, to take the fight to Russia with ATACMS, long-range missiles. She clearly wanted attacks on Crimea, attacks on Russian territory, like the kind of terror attacks we've seen on Belgorod, where a Christmas festival was attacked, where people have been civilians killed in the street because Ukraine is performing so poorly on the battlefield. It may be that she was pushed out because the Biden administration is forced to accept reality. They've been mugged by reality, as the veteran neocon Irving Kristol said. And they've installed in her place as a sort of placeholder. I think his name is John Moss. He's someone who helped preside over the disastrous but much needed U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. But we can deduce, just given the trajectory of Victoria Nuland's career and her legacy, that her resignation has everything to do with the failure of the Ukraine proxy war. This is someone who installed Vitaly Klitschko into office in the first place. She said in her leaked phone call with Jeffrey Piat, then the U.S. ambassador in 2014, that she called him Klitsch, should stay on the outside, and Yats, referring to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the Ukrainian zillionaire oligarch, should get the attaboy. In other words, he becomes the first president of this unelected putschist coup regime. Maybe she's no longer able to pull strings in Kiev. And it's also worth noting that Vitaly Klitschko has openly criticized Vladimir Zelensky, who is under pressure from all sides, and accused him, ironically, of running an anti-democratic regime. So Klitschko could be in the running for the presidency, as could the Ukrainian former chief of staff of the military, who Victoria Nuland was actually recently in Kiev. She was actually recently there in order to try to paper over and quell a dispute between him and Vladimir Zelensky, and it looks like she failed there.
So
in any
it could
case,
be the beginning of the end, couldn't it?
Well, one thing I can say for sure is Victoria Nuland will return to a place like the think tank she founded, the Center for New American Security, which is funded by the arms industry, which she said must be whose profits she said must be considered when Americans support, whether in American support for Ukrainian aid. In other words, she guaranteed herself her next paycheck through her role in the Ukraine proxy war. This is the kind of corruption, just criminal corruption, that's been legalized inside the Beltway as officials like her pass through the revolving door. But yeah, the Ukrainian proxy war should have ended by now. The failure of the Ukrainian forces to hold Avdiivka means they can no longer attack the Donbass. NATO weapons have failed to turn the tide of battle. The German tanks that we were told would help deliver, and Bradley Stryker vehicles that were said to be the magic bullet for Ukraine's counteroffensive, are being destroyed at rapid rates. And all the profits, as Victoria Nuland said, are coming back to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and places like Texas and Colorado and California, where the arms industry is based. Meanwhile, graves of 17-year-old Ukrainian girls are being found now in Ukrainian military cemeteries. That's blood on Victoria Nuland's hands.
Indeed so. Max, you and me in the Houses of Parliament over the next couple of months, it's a rain check, as you say, on your side of the puddle. Max Blumenthal, a prince amongst men and the editor of the Grey Zone News. Thank you for joining us.